John Ortberg preached one of the best sermons I've ever heard many years ago and then turned it into a book. The title of the book, if you're looking for something good to read, is When the Game is Over, It All Goes Back in the Box. John Ortberg. He talks about how when he was a little boy, his grandmother came to live with their family for a while. And his grandma was big into board games, and her favorite was Monopoly. And so almost every day, John and his grandma would sit down and play Monopoly together. And because Monopoly is a game about adult type things like real estate and money and property acquisition, grandma always won. But John, like a lot of us, was highly competitive, and so he was determined that one of these days he was going to beat her at that game. And one day it happened. Every roll of the dice went his way. Every break turned out in his favor, and soon he had all the desirable properties on the board. And he had these big stacks of multicolored cash, and he'd left his poor grandma utterly destitute. And he knew he had finally beaten his implacable foe. And he felt this moment of incredible triumph and accomplishment. And then his mom said, "Good game, Johnny. You finally beat me." And then she began to put all the things back into the box. And there went all of his cash, and there went all of his properties, and even that little shoe that he used as his game piece. It went back in the box, and he was left with absolutely nothing, and the feeling of victory was gone. And, well, you know where I'm going with this, right? We know that life isn't really a game, but we sometimes treat it like it is. Like if we can just get this or accumulate that, then we will have won. And your win depends on who you are. We all have a different win we're looking for, but there are three that are very popular: fame, power, and money. If you talk to young people today, they'll give one or some combination of those three as the thing that they're hoping for in life. But you think about the people who have the most adoration in our culture, we call them celebrities, who gain the most applause, the most attention, and yet, have you ever seen a less happy group of people? Think about how power warps a person's soul and really it drains them. Think about the picture of a president on the day of his inauguration compared to 4 or 8 years later, and how much he has aged in that time, because power alone is not enough. In fact, power can be exhausting. Think about money. You know, the richest man in the world is in the news a lot these days, and it might lead you to think that he's really the big winner in our world. And I don't say any of this to belittle him, but a few years ago, he gave an interview to a magazine, Rolling Stone magazine, in which he said that his biggest fear in life was loneliness, and that often, in spite of his hundreds of billions of dollars, the house is empty, and he just feels like his worst fear has come true. And it may be why he's had 12 different children with several different women in an attempt to fill that void. And I don't say this in a judgmental way, but to say this is someone who needs Jesus in spite of all of his billions. It's a proof that alone won't cure our problem. But what about family? There's an image from my favorite Christmas movie, It's a Wonderful Life, and it just kind of captures that movie. It kind of captures the idea that family is it. This past Christmas season on social media, a Christian that I follow posted that image and said, "This is what it means to be the richest man on earth." And I wanted to say yes, because I love that movie. I love that moment in the movie. But I also know the toxic idea that if I can just get the right spouse, if I can just get the right kids, if I can just have the right family, then everything that's empty in me will be filled. And that is a trap, I'm here to tell you, because the more pressure you put on your spouse and your children to meet the needs that you have in your heart, the more you will crush them. You'll end up a bitter person wondering what went wrong, while you have a spouse and children who feel estranged from you because they're a disappointment in your eyes. Watch out for this idea that family is the win, because it's not. It's a good thing, but it's not the win. Today, we're going to end our series about the life of Jesus. We talk about Jesus every Sunday. He's the one we worship. He's the one we preach about. But here at the start of the year, we've been looking at the common thread of all these stories is moments when Jesus astonished people. That word that means slapped into reality. When people said things like, "Who is this man?" or they were amazed. So today we're going to look at the last of those moments, and this is on the last day of Jesus' life when he had this encounter with the man who was judging him and judging whether to let him live or die. And we're starting with Matthew 27, verse 11. Now, the context here is the religious leaders have finally gotten what they hoped for. They've gotten Jesus in custody, and they want him to be executed. They want him to be executed by Rome. They could take him out and stone him. That's what happens to people who are guilty of blasphemy. And yet they also know that if they do that, they'll be in big trouble with the bulk of the people, right? Because the bulk of the people are on Jesus' side. They see him as a future Messiah. They don't want that. They want Rome to be at fault. So they bring him to Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea. Pontius Pilate is a Roman. He is highly ambitious. We know this from secular sources. He has reached the level of a Roman governor. He has to work in collaboration with the Jewish religious authorities. They don't really like each other, but they work hand in hand. They're symbiotic. And so they bring him this man and they say, he claims to be a king. That's sedition. You need to put him to death. So Pilate begins to question him. So here's Pilate, here's Jesus, and here's the Jewish leaders, a detachment of them, at least a delegation, standing there and accusing him, pointing fingers and speaking words of accusation. Now Jesus stood before the governor. And the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said, "You have said so." But when he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" But he gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. So Pilate here is in a delicate spot. He knows that he needs the support of these religious leaders to continue ruling. His win is to stay in power. In fact, to advance up the ladder of social and political success in Rome. I mean, somebody like him could be Caesar someday. And so he can't lose their favor. At the same time, he's a smart enough man to see what's going on here. He can look at this man and see this man poses no danger to Rome. He is not a threat. And yet he knows these people want him dead for some reason. He reasons in his mind, he must have offended these men in some way, and now they want me to take the hit. They want me to be responsible for his death. And Pilate does not want to give in to that. He does not want to be manipulated. And yet he's amazed at this man who chooses not to answer a single accusation. Pilate, in his lifetime, has seen a lot of things. He's seen good and bad in humans. He's never seen someone who would stand there and listen to folks reviling and blaspheming and cursing his name and accusing him of terrible crimes and not get angry and not show fear and not even defend himself. So Pilate doesn't know what else to do. He takes Jesus away by himself, away from the religious leaders. And you can probably imagine what he's thinking. He's thinking, listen, I can get someone to crack. This is one thing I can do. I've got the authority of mighty Rome on my side, and I will bring it to bear against this peasant, and he will crumble. And he'll either tell me what I need to hear to let him go, or he'll confess his crime so I can execute him with a clear conscience. So in John 18, verse 33, it says, so Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord? Or did others say this about me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own people, your own nation and chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world." Then Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" You can almost hear him say, "Aha, I finally have the confession I need." Jesus answered, "You say that I'm a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I've come into this world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" Now, that last question Pilate asked, that's the subject of great debate among Christian scholars. It's one of the debates of the ages. What did Pilate mean? And of course, we don't know. We don't have a recording, so we don't know what this tone of voice was. I feel very, very strongly that what Pilate was doing was dismissing Jesus at this point. He was saying, "Listen, is there something wrong with you? I'm talking about life and death here. I'm talking about the chance for you to be freed or to go to the cross. And you're talking to me about philosophy? What is this truth business? Let's get down to the question at hand." But the bigger thing in this last passage that I want you to see is Jesus' statement, my kingdom is not of this world. Pilate represents an earthly kingdom. Jesus says, I'm playing a totally different game than you are. You're trying to advance up the social ladder. I have no interest in that. I have a different win entirely. Now, Pilate's in a tough spot because he knows what can happen if he loses the favor of the Jewish leaders. You might think that as Roman governor, he has all the power, all the cards in the situation. But the truth is, there's a time that Pilate knows about when the Jewish leaders sent a detachment to Rome and said, we don't like the man who's ruling over us. It happened to be a son of Herod the Great, Herod Philip. And Caesar said, okay, I'll replace him, and sent Herod Philip off into exile. Pilate knows that could happen to him. If that happens to him, that's the end of his career, maybe the end of his life. By the way, there's also a mob forming outside as the sun starts to rise on Passover day. And so he says, I've got to do something. I have to square this circle somehow and please the religious leaders without doing what I know is wrong and without being manipulated. And so he sends Jesus to be flogged. You know, you have to be pretty inhumane to think that that's a solution. Because flogging is not simply lashing someone 39 times. That's what the Jews did. And while that seems barbaric to us, it was relatively humane. What the Romans did, I'm not going to tell you the details. You can read about it online. You can read about it. You can hear about it in any number of sermons. But it was a cruel and degrading punishment. It was a bloodletting, really, that often killed its victims. Pilate seemed to be saying, listen, if I punish this guy enough, I can stand him up in front of you and you'll take a look at him, your fellow Jew, in such a horrible condition, having endured such terrible treatment, and your heart will go out to him, and then I'll be off the hook. I can let him go, and you'll leave me alone. And so he has him flogged, and then he brings him before the people and says, behold the man. There's an image, a painting a couple of 100 years ago old called Ecce Homo. That's behold the man in Latin. And it pictures what that scene must have looked like, except, of course, Jesus in reality would have been covered in his own blood, would have been barely clinging to life, barely able to stand. And yet the people, probably the mob recruited by the religious leaders themselves, who knows, but certainly under their influence, begin to shout, no, crucify, crucify. Pilate even tries to have him released under an old tradition that says that the governor releases one prisoner to the people, whoever they choose, but their sympathies aren't with Jesus. They ask instead for someone who's an absolute insult to Rome, a revolutionary named Barabbas. Pilate is stuck now. He knows the water is really getting hot, and so he has one last hope. He takes Jesus aside one more time and essentially pleads with him. In John 19, verse 10, so Pilate said to him, you will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you? Jesus answered him, you would have no authority over me at all, unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin. And at that, when Pilate hears him say, you have no authority over me, he knows that he can't win this battle, that he can't get what he wants. And so he seeks to absolve himself. You know, the definition of poor leadership is when you refuse to take responsibility. And that's what Pilate does. He goes out in front of the crowd and washes his hands, as if to say, I'm not guilty of this man's blood. And he sends him to be crucified. You know, whenever I read this story, even though I know that Jesus dying for me is the most important thing that's ever happened, that if Jesus hadn't died for me, if he would have spoken up for himself, then I'd be lost forever, and so would you. And in spite of all of that, every time I read this story, I can't help putting myself in the position of his mother or one of his disciples or one of his followers. And I would have been pleading with him, speak, Jesus, just say something. Tell him that they're lying about you. Answer the charges against you because you're innocent. Show him who you really are so you can go free. And there's a reason why Jesus doesn't do that, why he holds silent as a lamb, according to the words of Isaiah 53, as a lamb before its shearers is silent. So he did not open his mouth. Because Jesus had a different kind of win. See, Pilate's win was advancing in his career, and he couldn't risk that for the sake of this Galilean peasant, so he gave him up. But Jesus' win was completely different. Jesus didn't care about power. He'd come from power, the greatest power ever. He gave it all up to come here. He didn't care about fame. The applause of men didn't matter to him. When crowds would come, he would say things that were so difficult they would melt away. When people would come to him and say, I want to follow you, Lord, to the very death, he would say, are you sure? You need to count the cost first, because I don't have a place to lay my head at night. Do you want to sacrifice like that? He didn't care about money. Think about a man who could conjure food from nowhere. Think about how much money you could make. I mean, let's face it, if you could conjure Chick-fil-A sandwiches on Sundays, you'd be a billionaire. Jesus could have made anything he wanted anytime he wanted, but he didn't care about that. He didn't care about anything. Jesus could have gotten married and had a family. There would be nothing sinful about Jesus doing that, and yet that wasn't his mission. That wasn't his win. Jesus explained his win in Matthew 20, verse 28. He said, the Son of Man, that's him, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. In that world, if you owed a debt that you couldn't pay, the next step was slavery. And you worked until that debt was worked off, unless someone who loved you was able to raise the money to pay the ransom, which is the debt you owed, to go free. Jesus said, I am coming to give my life as a ransom because the people I am trying to rescue, their debt is so big, there's no financial capital that can pay it off. It will take my death. And this is why when Jesus was stretched out on the cross, he used the last breath in his body to say the words, it is finished, which was his way of saying, I've won. I've crossed the finish line first. I have accomplished what I came here to do. I've given my life as a ransom. And now anybody who wants salvation can come through me. And every time one of us comes through that door of salvation, his victory is validated and there's rejoicing in heaven. What is your win? That's the question today. What win are you seeking? Be honest with yourself. I'm not asking you to say out loud. Be honest with yourself. What is the win that you seek that you think you can't be happy without? See, I have this theory about unhappy Christians, and I know, sad to say, I know several of them. I think there's a reason why people who go to church and who pray and who try their best to follow the commandments of Scripture can still be as unhappy as any unbeliever and sometimes even unhappier, and that's because they're trying to use Jesus to get what they want out of this world. They know what their win is, and they want to manipulate Jesus into giving it to them. And that's why they do the things they do. They want Jesus to give them the approval of those that they care about, or they want the power that this world offers, and they hope Jesus can give it to them, or they want the wealth that this world offers, and they hope Jesus can give it to them, or they hope they can have the picture-perfect family, and if I'm a good enough believer in Jesus, surely he'll deliver that. But Jesus said that's all wrong. In Matthew 16:25, he said, for whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Now, if that doesn't wrap your brain into knots trying to figure out what he meant, then I don't really understand you. But what it does mean is we have to play the game totally differently than our instincts tell us, than this world tells us. Let's face it, if you follow Jesus, you're going to seem a little strange because your win is different than the world's win. Instead of seeking to get rich, you're going to want to be generous. That's the win. The win is not in the things you accumulate, it's in the things you give away. And that's, let's face it, not the best strategy in the world to gain great wealth. Although I do know some people who have given greatly and God has blessed them even greater. Instead of seeking to become powerful, the people who win in Christ's eyes are those who give power away, who spend their time serving others instead of lording it over those who work under them. Instead of constantly trying to impress other people, we serve an audience of one. Can I just give a testimony for a minute? I'm really talking about idols here. And one of the idols that for a lot of my life I've fought against and still have to fight against sometimes is that idol of approval and of wanting to impress people and of wanting to please people and of wanting to be liked and wanting to gain the applause of humans. And yet, as the Lord has worked on me and I've learned to serve an audience of one and to please only Him, the peace that I feel. There was a time earlier in my pastorate, in my career in the ministry, when if someone left my church, I took it personally. And now when that happens, as long as they go to another church, I'm happy for them. I can see them in the grocery store, and I don't have to pretend to be glad to see them. I can sleep well at night. If somebody's angry at me, as long as I know that I've done everything I can to make it up to them, I can sleep well at night knowing that it's okay. My Father's pleased with me. There's such peace in giving yourself to the Lord. And I'm learning that the more I do it. And even when it comes to family, here's what I've learned. This is hard. But I've learned that the more somebody wants the perfect marriage, the worse they will be. The more I want the perfect marriage, the worse a husband I will be. Because what I end up doing because of my sin nature is I look at my marriage and I think, well, we got it pretty good, but it would be perfect if she would just do this. Or if she would stop doing that. And pretty soon, all I can think of is all the things we don't have. When instead, if I give myself fully to the Lord, then I'm focused on the ways I still need to grow in Christ. I'm focused on my sins, not someone else's shortcomings. And I'm starting to grow into the person who can really love my wife. And that makes me an easier person to love. And so we both win. And the same with our children. If I look at my children and I say, okay, you need to be the valedictorian and the quarterback of the football team, and you need to be the best dressed and most friendly, and you need to be everything that I hope you would be, I will crush them with that. I wasn't those things. Why would I expect them to be? And even if I was, that's not the win. There's a class of Christian parent that says, okay, my family, my church, I'm going to outsource the spiritual development of my children to my church, to my Christian school, to other people. When instead, we give ourselves fully to the Lord so that we become the people who can pass along our faith to the next generation, who can love our kids for who they are instead of who we expect them to be. That's the win. When we give ourselves fully to Him, when we lose our lives for His sake so we can gain everything. The happiest people I know are the people who've made that decision, who've realized I need to every day wake up and say, how can I give myself fully to the Lord and to others? The unhappiest people I know are people who are still trying to figure out how to manipulate God into giving them what they want. Where are you on that continuum as a Christian? John Ortberg closes out this sermon by retelling a comedy bit from Jerry Seinfeld, of all people. And Seinfeld talks about how when you're moving, and isn't moving the worst? When you're moving, you become obsessed with boxes. Everywhere you go, you're on the lookout for boxes. You smell boxes. You go to the grocery store, and you're like, they're bound to have boxes here. All those fruits and vegetables have to come in some kind of box. And you even go to a funeral, and you're like, hey, that's a nice box. You can put a lot of stuff in there. It's got those great handles. He says, because death is really the last big move, isn't it? And all your closest friends are there, the ones you would ask for a move that important. The trouble is, when you find the perfect box, you're in it. And Ortberg says, because when the game's over, it all goes back in the box. So you've listened very politely this morning, and I don't know anything about what you're thinking right now, but there could be some here who are thinking, okay, that's all well and good, but I think I'm the exception. I think that I can seek after wealth or power or money or fame. I can seek after a perfect family. I'll get it. I will get out of this world what I want. I am more determined than you can imagine. Maybe you're right. I'm dead certain you're wrong, but maybe you're right. And even if you are, the fact of the matter is, and you can't deny this, once the game's over, it all goes back in the box. You may have a few years where you've hit the heights, but it will all seem like nothing. It will all seem like a dream you once had, and now you can't really remember the details of it. See, when Jesus died, when he crossed that finish line, after paying his ransom for you and me, his enemies closed him up in a box of sorts. They rolled a big heavy stone over the opening of a cave, and they posted a guard, and they said, well, I'm glad that's over. And then on Sunday morning, that stone was rolled away, and he came out. And it wasn't over at all. In fact, it was just beginning. And that means that you and I can experience a life that doesn't go back in the box. That means that whatever we try to gain for ourselves, yes, it dies. But whatever we give to him never dies. So choose wisely. You only get one crack at this game. What is your win going to be?